As we continue on here in John chapter 2, and we start to talk specifically about the wedding at Cana, there are certain things we want to pay attention to. First off is the indication that Jesus is an invited guest. Uh, his disciples were invited. It appears that his mother also was invited, right? She was there, and they were invited. So this is uh, an appearance at which he is participating in hospitality, but the wedding doesn't go off so well. The wine runs out, and Jesus' mother says, "You know what? They don't have any wine." Well, this becomes an interesting discussion based on the traditions of a community of faith. And there are different interpretations for what the wine actually might mean. Not all of them are literal. Symbolically, some people see this as being representative of the Spirit, that it's representing they don't have the Spirit at this point in time, and Jesus needs to do something about that. Others see this wine representative of the Eucharist. It is a well-known tradition that John has no Eucharistic meal with his disciples before he is arrested. And so this wine might symbolize the Eucharist to try and provide that between John 2 and John 6 with the food, the bread of life, that there's a different take on the Eucharist. So there are other symbolic things. Um, Allegorically, wine can be used to represent a lot of different things. It can have a reference to the provision by the gods, because wine originally in the ancient world was to being something the gods provided. And then, of course, you have the Greek god and the Roman god and of wine and providing wine of the grape harvest. And then it could also be a reference to creation, because this is the seventh day and have something to do with the primeval water that God brings forth and provides for humanity. But the important thing, and the important words perhaps, are the words of the steward, because it's not just any wine that Jesus provides. It is indeed the best wine, the good wine, the highest quality wine, and demonstrating the abundance of what is happening. So there are lots of ways in which people try to get into the story of the wedding at Cana. But what we want to pay attention to are some of the literary features that happen. And the pattern that is being portrayed here is that first there is an action of Jesus, or an action by Jesus. Jesus does something. In this case, he tells them to fill up some uh, vats with wine, some purification jars with wine. And then, based on the action of Jesus, people respond to him. So there are going to be a response. In this case, it is the people who were serving the wine. They knew what had happened. It was the disciples who responded to him. But most of the other people didn't know much that was going on. There was an honor paid to the host of the party, a great honor paid to the host of the party, rather than dishonor of running out of wine. But the others were just, they had their wine and they were placed in that. The third thing that comes up that we want to pay attention to is the discussion of signs, because this is the beginning of the signs, the first of the signs Jesus did in Cana, and disciples believe. So the relationship between signs, what are called semeia, could also be translated as evidence of God being at work, and the people response of belief. Not all the time do signs result in belief. And that's one of the conundrums of the Gospel of John. But we have to remember the location. Here, Jesus is in Galilee. Galilee typically is represented as a good place for Jesus. The other Gospels also portray Galilee as a good place for Jesus. On the other hand, Judea is oftentimes portrayed, Jerusalem specifically, as not a good place for Jesus, where the signs are done, but people yet do not believe. And so we have that issue that's happening in this particular element. And then we find in John chapter 2, verse 12, a transition, a very important transition, right? After this, he went down to Capernaum. So Cana of Galilee is in Galilee. It is to the west of Capernaum. Capernaum is on the Sea of Galilee, oftentimes known as the Sea of Tiberias at that point in time, named after the emperor Tiberius from Rome. And he and his mother and his brothers and his disciples. So were his brothers also at the wedding? It would appear that they were, though they are not mentioned. But they go down to Capernaum, and Capernaum seems to be the place where Jesus headquarters out of in Galilee. Not Nazareth and not Cana. And they stayed there a few days. And so we have the change of timing. So the first 7 days are pretty well accounted for. Now it's just, oh, well, they stayed there a while. And the next thing we know, it is now Passover happening in the spring. So what is the relationship of time? Is it a day? Is it a week? Is it a month between these activities? We actually do not know. But if his disciples believe, what about his mother and his brothers? Did they also believe? That we do not actually know. Things just did not happen. And so then now we come into the Passover. One of the differences between the Gospel of John and the Synoptics is the number of Passovers. John shows 3 Passovers happening here, then in chapter 6, and again at the end in chapter 13, 14. The others have 1 Passover, which is most likely. We talked about the historical issues that surround John in the Gospel of John. Those issues that surround John and the Gospel of John. And one of those is, which is most historically likely? Well, any of the Jews who lived in Galilee would have been obligated at least once, if not all 3 times per year, to descend upon Jerusalem. Although the technical term is they would go up to Jerusalem, because they always go up to Jerusalem, no matter if they're coming from the north or the south, whether they're coming geographically down a mountain or up a mountain. But they would go there. And so the fact that the Synoptics only have 1 account of Jesus' Passover leads one to think that he may never have gone to Passover, yet he is a compliant Jew following Torah and the instructions, so he very likely would have done that. When he is at then Jerusalem, he goes to the temple. Now, the temple was a very large place, and there are 2 elements to the temple. Sometimes we are familiar with Greek temples, and a Greek temple may have had a pillar of columns. There was a temple in Ephesus to Artemis, and they had great columns. You can see the columns along the road beside me, that these would have supported a tall building, such as is in the distance right there. And so it would have had a roof over most of the temple. But in Jerusalem, the temple was a large open space that was approximately 6 football fields long and approximately 150 8 or 10 wide. So it's about 1,800 feet by 1,500 feet. So very, very large area. And in the center was the covered part. And it was a very small section of the entire temple. And this was the inner sanctum where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. The veil divided that place in two. And the rest was an open courtyard with around the outside some shaded roof areas for people to sit out of the shade, out of the sunshine. But these have two different terms. So you have the hiero or the naos, the hiero or naos. One is the temple as its big structure. And so for that, I sometimes say at the temple. And the naos was a building you could go inside of, or the English in the temple. Although crossing in to the temple would mean you were on the temple, like being on the pitch or on the court or on the football field, not in the football field, but in the stadium would be the correct selection, even though you may not be on the football field, in the stands versus on the court. So they have these two different terms for that. And so then we ask once again, we have the event that takes place where Jesus cleanses the temple, as it's called, and he drives the moneymakers out. Well, they would not have been in the naos, they would have been in the hiero or hieros. So they were in this open air space and taking up space for those who would be worshiping and probably creating a congestion zone. But eventually it's not a place of prayer. And so after doing this, the Jews asked him for a sign. What sign will you show us? Well, for the person familiar with the gospel, he has already turned water into wine in a symbolic gesture of creative powers of God. We know from the previous accounts that he is God. The Word was God. And yet those who are there don't have all this information in the story, but the reader does. So they ask for a sign. So there's an action by Jesus, the cleansing of temple, and then the request for a sign, as though the sign would bring belief. So Jesus then says, here's the sign, destroy this temple and I'll raise it up in 3 days. And they say, you're crazy, because Herod has been revamping this for 46 years. It's still under control. It's still under construction. It's not yet done. And so Herod and his son are continuing to improve this major temple area. But he wasn't speaking about the physical temple, because they talk about the hieros, and Jesus is talking about the naos, right? So they talk about hiero, he is talking about the naos, which is a double-sided sword. So it's like being on the court versus in the stands. It's a whole different kind of ball game. So here they ask for a sign. He gives them a sign, but they don't believe. But the disciples believe after he is resurrected. They remember the scripture and believe that. And so they remember his logos, his word, the things that are happening. Well, that pretty much brings us to the end of chapter 2, except for the very brief transition. When he was in Jerusalem at Passover, many believed in his name, observing the signs which he was doing, which raises the question, what signs was Jesus doing in Jerusalem? And in reality, the story hasn't told us. So John sometimes has a topic of these signs, and yet many times the signs are not described and narrated. So was he healing the sick? Was he casting out demons? Things that would have happened or been recorded in the synoptics? What type of signs was he performing? But Jesus' response to their belief based on his signs in Jerusalem is not to trust them, because he knows all men and didn't need any testimony, because he knows what's in a man. And then, as we'll see as we turn to John 3, there was a man. So there's a person who is perhaps believing in him because he's seen the signs. And then we have a conversation with Nicodemus. So that then brings us to the end of John 2, at least in an overview side.